You're listening to the Best of the Rich Dad Radio Show, featuring Robert and Kim Kiyosaki.
So we're here with Mark Moss. He did a report on this guy named Klaus Schwab, which I've only heard rumors about. So that's why this program is a very important show to find out what's going on.
And Mark's got his new book called Uncommunist Manifesto.
That's right.
It just came out.
The Uncommunist.
The Uncommunist Manifesto.
So who is this guy Klaus Schwab one more time, and what are they really up to?
Yeah, so founded the WF, the World Economic Forum. And I think it's important to understand, too, like where we're at in the world, right, where this peak centralization, central planning.
Right.
I like to say central planning always fails. And because they don't have enough data, they know they don't have enough data. You can't organize billions of people, right? But they're trying to. And so central planning, so it's World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization.
Fauci?
Yeah.
UN.
World Meteorological Association. And then, the UN, the IMF, the BIS.
What's the BIS?
So that's the
Bank of International Settlements.
The Bank of International Settlements, that nobody knows what the BIS is. And the BIS...
It's the central bank.
The central bank of central banks, exactly. And so if you look at an org chart, I have in a presentation I gave, I think it was at George's conference, I had an org chart of the way I see the world. And on the org chart, the BIS sits at the top. Below the BIS, then you have some of these think tanks. So the World Economic Forum is one of them, the Club of Rome, and so they're the policy makers. And then they push it down to the next row in the org chart to the policy enforcers, which are the governments. And so the governments sit a few levels down. So it's really a coup of the bankers. And they use this banker, the BIS at the top, to push these ideas through the think tanks and then down to the policy enforcers. And then we're down at the bottom of the subjects of all that, right? So Klaus is kind of running this. He's sitting on top of the world, hobnobbing with all these people, flying their private jets over to Davos, telling us that we need to cut back on our energy, telling us that we need to eat the bugs. This is on their website. They're talking about why we should be eating bugs or more sustainable.
I've seen
was
it.
it Kim Basinger? Or no, who was Nicole Kidman? Nicole Kidman, there was she made a commercial, I think 2 weeks ago, of her actually eating bugs. That's what they're putting on TV now.
Okay, so food. We were talking about food.
So food.
Okay, so
Bugs
let's
are
go.
food.
Let's talk about food. What's happening? So
Yeah.
we talked about Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
What's happening in Europe?
Yeah, so let's talk about food. So the food is the first attack vector. So I was on Fox Business 2 weeks ago. They asked me about an article the UN put out, and the UN titled the article, Why It's Good to Be Hungry, why being hungry is good. And they were saying we need people to be starving because there's all these jobs that have to be done that nobody would do unless they were starving.
Who said that?
It was an article on the UN website.
Wow.
And like I said, Fox had me on to talk about it. They took it down after half a day because the backlash was so insane. But per the UN, about 868 million people could starve to death in the next 24 months, almost a billion. So
In the next 24 months?
Yeah. And so at a time, Marxism, whenever Marxism has been tried in Russia in the early 1900s, about 25 million people starved to death. In Mao's Great Leap Forward, about 50 million people starved to death. Those were horrific, 50 million people.
And they killed them, too.
We're talking about almost a billion now. And so at a time when we have almost a billion people that could be starving to death, shouldn't we be trying to get as much food as possible out? We would try to do everything we can. But in Holland, they've gone and shut down the farms. They're trying to take over their land, and they want to take over the farms and stop them from growing not just food, but also raising cattle and meat. And so now it's massive protests are happening in Holland at a time where we need more food. In the United States, the farmers are being paid not to plant. They're not allowed to plant on some of their land. And they went and they petitioned the Secretary of Agriculture and said, hey, let us plant. We can get more food. And they said, no. It's not in line with our agreement for the Paris Accord.
The Paris Accord.
Which is the environmental thing.
Which is the environmental thing, which is what President Trump had pulled us out of. And then Biden's very first day in office, the most important thing he had to do by executive order was put us back into the Paris Accord. So we can't grow food in the United States because of climate change. Holland can't grow food. And now the protests are happening all over the world, and it's even bigger. So like in all throughout Europe, there's an energy crisis going on. Everybody should know that by now. I've been talking about it for 2 years. And they don't have natural gas. They're dependent on Russia for natural gas. But we need natural gas in Europe to make fertilizer, and we need fertilizer to grow food. We also need natural gas to process food.
Okay, what are the three things that what did the kitchen service say? The three
So food,
points?
and then the next one is the energy,
And next one is?
and then the money.
Right, and that's what Rickers is talking about.
Yeah.
The CBDC, central bank digital currencies.
I read a story on the thing on energy, and this farmer was told, "Oh, you have to turn all your equipment to electric by a certain time, by like within the year." He goes, "Oh, well, that's fine, except I run 24 hours a day during the harvest, and I have to have these vehicles here at this time. And if one breaks down, how do I get it?" You know, there's like no thought given at all. Just, oh, you have to be electric.
Yeah.
It's impossible. I mean, it's impractical, and it's not going to work. And it's to your point, it's going to put more farmers out of business.
I'm constantly reminded by an Ayn Rand quote from Atlas Shrugged, where she says, when you must receive permission to produce from men who produce nothing."
Yeah, and I just want your audience to think about this for a moment, because I really want to beat this dead horse, because I think it's important. We are experiencing global consumer price inflation right now.
Right.
Not just this is a huge, huge problem. A problem that we haven't seen since the 1970s.
This is the biggest global crisis since World War II.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was just today.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead, keep going. Excuse me.
And their solution is to do what? UBI. Let's give people more money, and let's restrict the supply of goods and services even further by making it harder for the producers to actually produce. So what they're doing, they're trying to sell this to the general public. The way we solve consumer price inflation is by creating more money and producing less stuff. It's the complete opposite. Yeah, we need less money and we need more stuff.
So let me ask this question. When you give people money, does it increase the debt?
Well, it depends on how that money is generated. But
I understand, but somebody's going to pay the piper in there.
Yeah, usually it's going to be produced through the issuance of new debt. So if it's the government issuing new debt for that deficit spending, or if it's a bank issuing new consumer debt, then you've got a debt, you've got a loan to match up with that new money that was created. Yeah.
So is there any money in a credit card?
Is there any money? Yeah, a credit card increases the money supply.
No, but is there any money in it?
Oh, no.
It's debt.
Yeah.
And that's how money is created.
Yeah.
You have to borrow it into existence.
Yeah, that's right.
That was 71. You have to borrow the money and money is created. That was a fractional reserve system. Fractional reserve system says you put your savings in a bank, let's say $100, the bank can lend out 1,000, 10-to-1 leverage in there.
Yeah, now they don't even need that.
No. And that's
they don't really need reserves at all to lend. They can just create money out of nowhere. And that goes back to the central bank digital currency and them trying to ban cash.
And I think that's why so many young people are in crypto. They know something's wrong. They just don't have the big macro picture of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they get caught up in all these swings. So you were talking about CBDC, central bank digital currency. What does that mean to you, George?
Well, a central bank digital currency simply means that we all the average Joes and Janes in society, including the businesses and corporations, now have an account with the central bank. In our case, it would be the Federal Reserve.
But isn't that Marxism, central banking?
It's absolutely 100% central planning. Because what happens now is the banking system is in charge of creating most of the new money. Now, it's a little bit different with these deficits and quantitative easing and whatnot. But usually it's the banking system. So if they keep that loan on their balance, if the bank continues to own the loan, they want to lend to someone who's going to pay them back, right?
Really?
So hopefully they're going to lend it for productive purposes, meaning the majority of money that's being created is going to create more goods and services.
Right.
And that's why you don't have the inflation, even though the money supply increases. Now, what
It's
happens...
called capitalism.
Yeah, and that's why the free market works.
Right.
So, and that's, by the way, why the free market creates deflation.
Right.
Not inflation.
Exactly.
Prices going down.
Capitalism actually brings prices down.
Yeah.
Because you can't compete otherwise.
Yeah, which brings the standard of living for the poor and middle class up.
Yes, but they're teaching Marxism in school. That was my book, Capitalist Manifesto.
Yeah.
That whole thing is so backwards, run by school teachers. Oh, my God.
Yeah, exactly. So if we move into the system with a central bank digital currency, then all the bank accounts go to the Fed, and then the Fed determines who gets the loan and why. And the big key there is the Fed doesn't have a profit and loss. They can lose money. So where a bank has to lend productively, The Fed can lend in a way that isn't productive. They can lend to whomever they want. They don't have to worry about being paid back. So that's centrally controlled money supply, debt creation. And that, to your point, is Marxism.
But it's also a massive control. It's Orwell. Big Brother is watching.
Yeah.
They can tell exactly where you're spending your money, what are you spending on, and where is it?
Yeah, so going back to the IMF and this gal that's in charge that was speaking at Davos, she was saying how we need a central bank digital currency and the global governments need to come together. And of course, the IMF would manage this in the World Economic Forum, but they need to come together to create a solution for cross-border payments. This is how she's selling it, is that all these poor people have to pay Western Union, 20% fee or whatever. And she's right, but she doesn't care about that. She just cares about the solution, which is the global governments coming together with this payment system for cross-border that's seamless and free. But, of course, we're using a central bank digital currency. And then the reserve asset becomes the SDR, which is the currency of the IMF.
Special drawing rights.
They have control over the money supply, and it's not the system we have now with the United States having the global reserve asset or the global reserve currency and the banking system creating that currency globally.
Right. The biggest thing with central bank, I'm not financial. I mean, not crypto smart or anything. But it's Orwell's Big Brother is watching. They can track you, and the reason I like this stuff here, it's real gold. This has been here since the Earth was formed. This is silver, been here the Earth is formed. I can run with this and spend it anywhere in the world. They can't track me.
Yeah.
And so when Bitcoin came out, remember that they were saying, oh, they're going to use it for the drug trade and all that. I said, well, you think dollars aren't?
Yeah, exactly.
Give me a break. I mean, how can people be that stupid and drink the Kool-Aid from the Fed?
Well, not everybody is. I was in the airport yesterday, and I was going through the line, the security line, and actually saw someone wearing a shirt that said "Make 1984 fiction again."
What does 84 mean to you? Because that's a really interesting book,
Well, it's pretty much what we're seeing play out right in front of our own eyes. I mean, it was supposed to be fiction. But in my opinion, this is the objective of these Davos types, the global elite. And I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I think they're coming right out and saying that, hey, we want the world to consume less energy. We want to reduce the population, or the birth rate, they'll say. And we want to, we want power and control because it's in your best interest. Look at what the WHO came out with, this health treaty. Did you see that?
The World Health Organization.
Yeah, they came out with this opinion. I don't know if it was this proposal for a treaty where basically they control in the future every country's position on lockdowns, on mask wearing, on all of these things that we've seen play out in 2020 and 2021. The WHO wants to be in charge of all of that. So all these countries sign treaties that say, yes, we're giving our health sovereignty over to you global elite.
But that's the World Health Organization, the World Bank. Everything is world.
Yeah.
There's no sovereign.
Yeah.
No national.
Yeah,
world.
That's right. Well, so you've got these two opposing forces going on right now. Most of us in the real economy, and I think the people listening to this show, they want decentralization. They want control of their own destiny. Where
they want privacy also.
And privacy.
Freedom.
Yeah. And
a few privacy, freedom, a few words like that.
And they want it for their children.
Right.
Where these Davos types, they want the opposite. They want complete centralization because they think that all of us are inferior, stupid, yes, dumb rubes. And, we're only going to make things worse. So we need to give them all of our freedoms, all of our liberties. They need to have complete control to be able to micromanage our life. And that's the only way that, in their minds, that we're going to survive.
That's what...
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Kiyosaki, co-host of the Rich Dad Radio Show. Robert and I have warned that 2023 was going to be a roller coaster of volatility. After all, the stock market is largely flat this year, except for a handful of tech companies. And other asset classes are struggling to meet expectations. One survey reveals that living paycheck to paycheck is the most common lifestyle in America, even for those making six-figure incomes. Combined with hundreds of thousands of layoffs in just the last few months, it's clear a financial storm is brewing. The question to ask yourself is, are you safe? For years, Robert and I and other investors have been putting more and more money into assets that can still climb when the stock market flatlines. One investment that doesn't seem to be affected by the ups and downs of the stock market is art. In fact, one of our close friends and advisor recommends art as his number one asset protection. Even more, contemporary art prices have outpaced the S&P 500's total return over the last 27 years by 136%. If you think art as an investment is something you want to pursue, then there is a vehicle that allows you to do that without investing millions, thanks to Masterworks, our longtime sponsor. Their platform lets you invest in shares of painting by icons like Picasso and Banksy. Masterworks now has $800 million in assets under management. But thanks to our friends at Masterworks, you can skip their waitlist. Just click the link in the description for this episode. Offerings have sold out in minutes, but Rich Dad listeners can skip the waitlist going to masterworks.art/richdad. That's masterworks.art/richdad. See important disclosures at masterworks.com/CD. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Kiyosaki, co-host of the Rich Dad Radio Show. And I want to thank today's sponsor, our friends at Gold Alliance. You know, we should all be concerned about high inflation, a looming recession, the very troubled banking system, and out-of-control spending in Washington. And the fact is, during every major crisis in U.S. history, many of those who failed to prepare watch their savings, investments, and retirement funds plummet, while others with the foresight to own gold help preserve their wealth and purchasing power. Now, we're facing several major crises at once, and we may soon face even more economic turmoil. So please don't wait. Consider gold and put yourself on the road to financial peace of mind. The new free 2023 Gold Guide from our friends at Gold Alliance can show you how. Just visit www.freegoldguide.com/Robert or call 1-800-473-4585. Republican governor and conservative commentator Mike Huckabee says Gold Alliance is the only gold provider he recommends to his friends and family. Please visit freegoldguide.com/Robert or call now at 1-800-473-4585. Thank you.
Feeling powerless over current events and your financial future? Financial freedom is your freedom. Robert Kiyosaki is the best-selling author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Over 40 million people have taken Robert's advice. Now it's your turn. Attend Robert's free virtual wealth building event. Claim your free access now at richdadfree.com. Don't wait, access is limited. Go to richdadfree.com. That's richdadfree.com.
And so our guest today, or my dear friend here, is Andy Schectman. And you sent me this picture of Janet Yellen, which you will see. See?
Will the deposits in every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of their size, be fully insured now? Are they fully recovered? Every bank, every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of the size of the deposit, will they get the same treatment that SVB just got or Signature Bank just got?
A bank only gets that treatment if a majority of the FDIC board, a supermajority of the Fed board, and I, in consultation with the president, determine that the failure to protect uninsured depositors would create systemic risk and significant economic and financial consequences.
So what is your plan?
Made that determination.
Right. So what is your plan to keep large depositors from moving their funds out of community banks into the big banks? We have seen the mergers of banks over the past decade. I'm concerned you're about to accelerate that by encouraging anyone who has a large deposit in a community bank to say, we're not going to make you whole, but if you go to one of our preferred banks, we will make you whole at that point.
Look, I mean, that's certainly not something that we're encouraging.
That is happening right now.
That is happening because depositors are concerned about the bank failures that have happened and whether or not other banks could also
No,
fail.
it's happening
And
because you're
it's-
fully insured no matter what the amount is. If you're in a big bank, you're not fully insured if you're in a community bank.
Well, you're not fully insured. And
You
the big-
were at Signature, and
the
it
big-
just barely met that threshold. You were at Signature.
Well, we felt that there was a serious risk of contagion that could have brought down and triggered runs on many banks. And that's something, given that our judgment is that the banking system overall is safe and sound, depositors should have confidence in the system.
What did you hear in her DBC? Deception, betrayal, collusion. What was she saying that terrified you?
What she was saying, and first of all, thank you for such a wonderful introduction, and the feelings are mutual.
Sure.
I greatly appreciate it. What Janet Yellen was saying, we all left Monday thinking that, hey, it's okay. The banks are going to be bailed out, and it won't be at the taxpayers' expense, which we all knew was a lie. It would be at your dollars' expense or your deposits' expense, in the respect that the money had to be created out of thin air, and we just figured that would mean more inflation. And so all of the banks, regardless of their poor choices, their gambling, if you will, in depositors' assets, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that they'd be bailed out, and that this would just be an ever increasing party of printing and of backstopping the banks. And what she said yesterday was truly shocking to me. Basically, she was being grilled by a senator, I believe, from Oklahoma. And what he was asking was, so are you telling me then that all of the small regional banks in my state will be backed by the full faith and credit of the Fed, so that none of these banks are going, if they fail, they will all be bailed out the way that
Silicon Valley,
thank you, Bank did, and the other one that just failed as well. Sorry, my brain is kind of like a Nerf ball these days. The last 4 days have been unlike anything I've ever experienced.
Take one break. Show them the number of emails you just showed me.
Yeah, I have, this is just the very, very beginning of them, but I also have over 700 emails that I haven't even gotten back to. I'm trying, people. I will get back to you. This whole weekend, all I'm going to do is reply, but I think it was,
they're terrified, aren't they?
They are. And well, basically what she said was that the only banks that will be bailed out will be those banks that have the approval of the majority of the FDIC board, the majority of the Federal Reserve Board, and Janet Yellen herself. Those are the only ones that will be bailed out. In other words, those banks, she said, that in our minds are too big to fail, the systemically too big to fail banks. In essence, what she was saying was that all of those smaller banks are dead on arrival. They won't be bailed out. And if they're not deemed to be systemically important, then they will have no backstopping. And what that is basically doing is herding everyone into a pen of the 4, 5, 6 biggest commercial banks in the world, or in the United States, the Wells Fargos, the Bank of America, the Citi, the JP, the Goldman. All of them are going to be too big to fail, systemically too big to fail, interconnected with one another through a massive, massive amount of derivatives, whereby if they fail, they'll bring down the whole system. But the little banks who run into trouble, and we're going to talk about why they run into trouble in a moment, but those banks, no, they won't be bailed out, and too bad. And what that's going to do is collapse the entire small banking industry. The entire regional bank industry is going to collapse. Who's going to leave their money in these little banks If you're running a business, let's just say that the Rich Dad Network kept all their money in a small regional bank near your office, people that you've known and trust, and they've been great to you, and they know you by first name, and they know your staff by first name, and they treat you the way you expect to be treated. Not anymore. Those banks are not too big to fail. And if they go under because of the systemic nature of what is happening, they're not going to be bailed out. And it's important to understand something. So all of these banks over the last several years have accumulated with the deposits that they received since the president was able to remove all of the reserve requirements during the pandemic to zero. So most of these banks have virtually nothing in the way of currency on hand. And because they would take these deposits that came in from the depositors, and they would buy bonds with them, typically treasuries, and in many cases mortgage-backed securities, at rates above what they were paying, of course, to the depositors. But in what was typically considered safe places to be, the problem is all of those bonds have an average maturity or an average yield rather of about 2 to 2.5% and long maturities. And so the problem is that since interest rates have risen closer to 5%, every one of those bonds in their portfolio have lost 50% or more of their value. Now, the banking regulations say that they don't have to mark those to market until they sell them. And so they have a whole balance sheet filled with toxic assets that have lost over half their value or more. So in the case of SVC, when you saw a run on the bank, for whatever reason, you get people running on the bank because there's so little cash, the reserve requirements have been slashed to nothing. These banks are forced to sell their bonds at a huge loss in order to meet customer demands to get their money back. And if enough people redeem or withdraw their money, and the banks are forced to liquidate their bond holdings, which are all have been eviscerated by rising rates, then as we saw last week, a large bank can become insolvent in less than 24 hours. And that's exactly what happened. The FDIC can't handle this. Their insurance fund is only 0.03% of bank deposits, 0.03%, roughly 125 billion in FDIC liquidity backing over 9.5 trillion in deposits. And
Matt, those numbers again, the FDIC backs up 9.5 trillion, what?
$9.5 trillion worth of deposits with about 125 billion in cash. That's 0.03%. So if just one or two banks fail, that's it. That's gone.
So with that, welcome back, Jim, for this is the first part of 4. What do you see in 2023? And we're discussing China. And I'll give you, please talk about sold out really quickly, because this is the other day I was thinking about you. I was eating blueberries. Now, generally blueberries, I believe, come from Vermont. But here it is hardcore winter, and I think my blueberries were coming from Ecuador. That's supply chain, right?
Absolutely, that's a long supply chain. I don't know the exact distance, but probably a good 4,000 or 5,000 miles. One of it could be semiconductors or oil or blueberries, but stuff moves all over the world. That's exactly right, and it's being very disrupted right now.
So what else do you? So this is number 1 of a series of what do you see 23. You're talking about China, and there was that program called Evergrande, which was their big real estate crash. And, China's in serious trouble, and now COVID. So what do you see coming, for China? What do you want to talk about for the first part of a 4-part series?
Well, we spoke about China and covered that pretty in depth. So just to turn to the next thing I see in 2023 having a major impact on markets, I would say the situation in Ukraine. And there's a lot more there than just, there's obviously a war going on, clear, and Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the background of that. I have some pretty strong views. I think they're pretty well documented. Everyone's like, Russia's the bad guy because they invaded. okay, they did invade, but they were being provoked for 14 years. George Bush stood up in 2008 and said that he thought Ukraine and Georgia should be in NATO. And a few months later, Putin invaded Georgia and made sure Georgia would never join NATO. And then in 2014, the U.S. and UK staged a coup, using the CIA and MI6 to overthrow a pro-Russian president of Ukraine. He was duly elected. They had an election. I'm not saying that he was a great guy, but he was duly elected. He was pro-Russian, looking to enter into some trade linkages with Russia, and the U.S. and UK intelligence services staged a coup, threw him out. He ran out for Russia. We put in a puppet government, and then Putin invaded and took Crimea. So first Bush makes a clumsy statement, Putin invades Georgia. Then they stage a coup and Putin invades Crimea. And at that point, you're supposed to say, what part of the word invade do you not understand? In other words, Putin is telling us, don't go there. Ukraine's not going to join NATO. You've crossed a red line. Then he invaded Georgia and Crimea to show he was serious, and the U.S. still wasn't listening. Either that or we were listening and we wanted the war. And that's really my view. I think the warmongers, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Susan Rice, and there are others, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Vindman, this whole warmonger crowd wanted this war, and they got it. So here's your war. Now, the war is tragic. It's brutal. That's what war is. And that's been going on for a while. But there is a financial, economic war wrapped around the military kinetic war, because the U.S., we've been supplying weapons to Ukraine and training, and Poland. A lot of the so-called Ukrainian troops are actually Polish troops wearing Ukrainian army uniforms, because so many of the Ukrainian troops have been killed. Various weapon systems are being supplied. There's a drone war going on. Iran's giving drones to Russia. The U.S. has, its own drones. They're supplying them to Ukraine, et cetera. So that's been pretty well vetted. But the economic financial war around it, the U.S. has put sanctions on Russia. The U.S., but also make it clear, the U.S. and the EU and the UK and other allies have joined these sanctions against Russia, and they are unprecedented. And by the way, I spent a long part of my career working on sanctions. Financial warfare, exactly the kind of thing we're talking about now, is what I had done for over 10 years, longer actually, for the intelligence community. I worked on supporting intelligence support for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which looks at deals where foreign companies are buying U.S. companies, and you ask yourself, is there a national security threat here? It's not an antitrust review or securities law review. It's a national security review. And I used to do what we call collections, the intelligence collections, to support that analysis. And I teach financial work at War College. So it's just one of my specialties, and I know a lot about it. And when sanctions were announced, just to kind of give some examples. Sorry, Robert. So we froze the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia, completely unprecedented. We froze the reserves of oligarchs. We kicked the Russian banking system out of the international SWIFT message traffic system, that's where big banks record large transfers to each other. It's kind of the nerve center, the beating heart, if you will, of the global financial system, based in Belgium, and Russia has been kicked out of that, and a lot else besides. Limits on Russian oil exports, price caps on Russian oil, and so forth. And then Russia's retaliated. They banned certain exports of strategic metals, fertilizer, grain, and other essential goods to the rest of the world, or at least to countries that are participating in the U.S. sanctions. So I don't want to spend too much time going down the whole list. It's a long list, but the point is, it has been highly, highly disruptive to the supply chain and the food chain. It's contributed to inflation, and it's getting worse. So that much we know. We already know that, and it's a very big deal. What could get worse?
Let me interrupt real quickly. Again, Jim's latest book is called Sold Out. He's talking about supply chain. So this war in Russia and Ukraine is really a supply chain issue. That's how it affects you and me and all this. But isn't Ukraine also an exporter of food throughout the world?
Well, if you combine Russia and Ukraine, they provide 25% of global exports of wheat, 35% global exports of barley. Russia provides a large percentage of global fertilizer exports. So the answer is yes, absolutely. And if you look at it from the importing point of view, you say, okay, so Russia and Ukraine are 25% of the world's exports of wheat. It doesn't mean they grow that much wheat. It just means they export that much wheat. The U.S. grows more wheat, but we use it ourselves. We feed cows and pigs and make ethanol and do all kinds of other things with it. But Russia and Ukraine export a lot of it. But from the point of view of countries, you say, well, who gets their food from Ukraine and Russia? There you find countries get 75 to 90% of their food from those two places. And that includes countries like with large populations, Egypt, Sudan, countries in the Middle East, Kenya, and others, and many others. It's a long list. I actually took that list and added up.
Wait, so Jim,
Yes.
you're saying those countries you mentioned, because of this war in the Ukraine, which was, we pissed off Russia saying, they wanted Ukraine to join NATO and all this stuff. But
Right.
now the supply chain, which is your book, sold out, is the food now goes into those countries like Sudan and all that. Does that mean that their prices will go up for food, but the possibility of starvation goes up too?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not just about price. There's money around. You can get subsidies, but starvation is a bigger problem. And they've been scrambling since the war started last February. To the extent they've been getting anything, they've been drawing down reserves from the year before. So there is grain storage, and there was some left. But now the reserves have been drawn down. Some exports are trickling through, but it's a very small amount. And believe it or not, some of the exports are going to Europe, which has other resources. And so starvation is a real... You may end up with more people dying of starvation than dying in the war. But this is playing out in real time. I was not saying everything's happened right now. It's happening, and it's going to get worse as the winter progresses.
So I think I want to talk to you about you call it the circus. They removed the debt ceiling. It's only gotten worse since 71, hasn't it?
Well, that's a really interesting lead in, Robert. I'm amazed that so many people were concerned about the politics of raising the debt ceiling, and people don't seem to be concerned about the quantum of the debt or the ability to service the debt, or more importantly, the impact of the debt on future generations of Americans. A review of the arithmetic, if you might indulge me, I think is worthwhile. At the federal level, we now have permission to take the debt, I guess, to $34,400 and something million. The first thing that people need to understand is that that's 12 zeros to the right of the furthest left column. I mean, it's an amazing number. But if you compare the on-balance sheet liabilities of the United States with the off-balance sheet liabilities, the net present value of the off-balance sheet liabilities, it gets scarier. For your younger listeners, Robert, if they look at pictures of you and I, they see what an off-balance sheet liability looks like. It's an old person. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, federal pensions. That number, the net present value, according to the Congressional Budget Office, handily exceeds $100 trillion.
So that's the old guys are going to are a liability of $100 trillion.
The combination of off-balance sheet liabilities and on-balance sheet liabilities, note that's net present value, not gross value, exceeds $140 trillion. Now, it's interesting that J.P. Morgan Chase notes that the amount of private wealth which will be handed down to future generations is about $140 trillion, which is a different way of saying that the entirety of private inheritances is accounted for by the federal debt before state and local debt. And it's further important, I think, Robert, for your listeners to consider that we propose to service this debt, both on balance sheet and off balance sheet, with a budget that's in deficit $2 trillion a year. I don't know what your rich dad would suggest about further encumbrances if you were already over indebted. but I suspect I know the answer, and I suspect you might inform your listeners as to what that was.
Well, let me keep it. My rich dad, my poor dad was a PhD, went to Stanford, Northwestern University, Chicago, but that's why he was poor anyway. So, but my rich dad never went to school. So, I mean, he went to school up to 13. So he kept everything simple. He says, that's like trying to pay what you're talking about with the debt and all this. That's like trying to pay your mortgage with your credit card.
Right, right.
That's exactly what we're doing.
Well, my own stepfather, I remember telling me, one of the ways you get out of holes, you stop digging, And he went to Stanford. So,
I don't think we can anymore. Have we gone beyond the point of no return?
I'm not sure, Robert. I'm of two minds. I'm astonished at the strength of the U.S. economy in the face of increasingly idiotic regulation, stupefying taxation, and debt. And I draw some solace from the fact that, two facts. One, youth movements. 160,000 people having been through the programs of Students for Liberty over time. Robert, when I was 18 years old, I couldn't spell libertarian. And now we got 160,000 junior von Mises running around, which makes me feel good. I also feel good, I need to say, with the continued impact of technology. The United States is still this wonderful creative culture where 5 or 6 pimply-faced kids in Sunnyvale can commandeer a garage and out pops Google or out pops Facebook. I guess what I'm trying to say is I remain hopeful that our individual creativity and tenacity might be able somehow to finance our collective stupidity.
You are an optimist.
I mean, the alternative for that, Robert, would be for me to quit. And America wasn't built quitting. I think what you're doing, I think informing people of the fact that they are responsible for their own future.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.